Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. Today we've got an interesting topic. We're going to talk about the future of jobs. I've got with me Sudisha and Anu, who work with me on the project that we've been running called at Takshashila, called the 20 Million Jobs Project. The World Economic Forum has been publishing a biannual report, as many of you know, on the future of jobs since 2016. They've been this is the fourth report which has come out just now. Due to the pandemic, I think they sort of lost a year. And they've been tracking the labor market's impact of the fourth industrial revolution and the scale of the occupational disruption and growth and recommendations for job transitions from declining to emerging economies and so on. Each industrial revolution since the first one in 1765 have had a significant impact on jobs and disrupted economies, dislodged people, and caused a lot of heartburn and anxiety to many, while opening up new opportunities and a shift in the balance of power. And this is something that we've been talking about quite seriously over many episodes as well. We believe that when you have a disruptive technology coming in, jobs will be lost. Many jobs get lost, but then new jobs get created. Very often, the number of new jobs created so far has been greater over time than the jobs that were lost. But this current disruption, which we're talking about, promises to cause a little more anxiety and worry amongst a lot of people, especially with artificial intelligence and its threats of replacing so many of the jobs that are being done today. And its reach seems to be quite extensive. It seems to go across industries, it seems to go across regions and cause a lot of pain. So the World Economic Forum came up with this report and has done extensive research, interviewed over 803 companies to figure out what is their perspective on jobs, on the future of jobs. They've talked about what are the new types of jobs that will get created, what jobs will get impacted, what kind of new skills are required, are the people in their organizations capable of acquiring those skills and so on. They also participated along with partner institutes across the world to get a better regional coverage. And they've also looked at platforms like Coursera and LinkedIn and collected data from that. It's quite interesting. All three of us have read this report, and I'm sure have interesting things to share from it. So this is what we're going to talk about. And I've got Sudisha and Anu with me. Hello, Sudisha. Hello, Anu. How are you guys doing today?
Hi, everyone. I'm doing good.
Hi. Doing very well, Sridhar.
Yeah. So how do you want to take this off? I mean, when we talked about the fourth industrial revolution, she said, what are the four industrial revolutions? I mean, would it be interesting? Do you think it'd be interesting for our listeners to sort of describe what those four industrial revolutions that they're talking about?
I can't claim to know all four myself. So why don't you enlighten us, Sridhar?
See, the first industrial revolution was sort of from the beginning, end of the 18th century to the beginning of the 19th century. And mechanization was the first, right? So when machines were created, and mechanization was why agriculture started to be replaced by industry as the backbone of the societal economy. Till the end of the 18th century, it was all about agriculture. The countries which did well in agriculture, which had great agricultural production, etc., were dominated the world market. India, for instance, in the 16th century, had 25% of world trade, had a significant contribution to and a very high percentage of global GDP, right? But that changed with the first industrial revolution when mechanization took root. And then there was a lot of extraction of coal at that point, along with a significant invention of the steam engine. And that later developed, speeding up the manufacturing process, manufacturing of railroads, and that accelerated the economy, right? So that was the first industrial revolution that took place. People had to migrate out of agriculture into manufacturing and so on. And that led to a lot of shift in terms of the kind of people who were dominating. The power structures within countries changed, and it led to widespread disruption and positive growth, right? So I think that's what happened with that. But then in 1870, there were some new energy sources which were identified, like electricity, oil, and gas. And then came invention of the internal combustion engine. And with the internal combustion engine, we had the invention of the automobile and the aeroplane. And the second industrial revolution is considered one of the most important ones. And there was also demand for steel. There was chemical synthesis and methods of communication, such as the telegraph and the telephone. All that happened. And I think like that, the second industrial revolution took place over about a century. And then in 1969, in the second half of the 20th century, we see the emergence of a new source of energy, that is nuclear power. And nuclear power was leveraged by many countries. And this also gave forth to the rise of electronics, telecommunication, and of course, computers. So this opened the doors to space exploration, research, and so many other things that happened. And then this whole two major inventions here, programmable logic controllers and robots. This led to a high level of automation. Again, if you remember, I think there was a lot of issues. I remember there were a lot of strikes in India at one time against bank computerization and so on. All those things happened, but today you see that they all employ way more people than they did in the past. And it has led to new types of jobs. There's so many industries which are there today. 25% of India's exports are in IT, which never had. This didn't really exist. This whole industry didn't exist 25 years ago, right? So I think like that kind of change happened with the third industrial revolution. And today, what we're calling Industry 4.0, it's happening right now. And this report tries to understand the impact of the fourth industrial revolution. And this started from the turn of the century, and it started with the internet, right? Global supply chains, Internet of Things, outsourcing, and now artificial intelligence. I think like these are the four industrial revolutions that we talk about. And the current one is having a lot of interest.
So we're living through the fourth one then.
Yeah.
I think that's something that I want to touch on as well. Through the report, the one thing that stood out to me is throughout time and throughout history, people have always been scared of the next turn of technology. But what this report shows is the fact that business transformation will continue to depend on technology, and that trend is going to continue for most industries. But pieces like artificial intelligence and green jobs, which have typically evoked fear in the past for taking current jobs away, are actually going to be, essentially the way I understood it, is actually going to help increase jobs in the long term, right? So what you're going to see is automation of clerical jobs, perhaps, of bank tellers, of administrative work. But there is a growing demand, and what industries have also said in response to this survey is that they tend to see a net positive, especially in the areas of big data, in the areas of AI, agricultural operations and equipment management, and environmental management technologies. And we've spoken cybersecurity as well, which again, all of these areas we've spoken about extensively in the past as potentially job creators. So it was good to see it being validated by the industry as well. And then another thing that really stood out to me was the fact that there is like a structural reconfiguration of the labor markets, right? A lot of the roles that are coming up are essentially we're declining or growing really fast against their current benchmark, which may not always be the right way to look at it. But what that also means, and something again that we've spoken about, is people will require retraining, upskilling, and innovative ways to acquire these new age skills, and through potentially public policy outcomes or a combination of policy and private and public sector coming together, right? So that was a big, I know we'll get into more details on what each of these industries can represent in terms of job growth. But that for me, my big takeaway, right, is how do we make sure equitable growth can continue to happen, upskilling, reskilling become more funded and more viable, and then taking the stigma away potentially from pieces like green jobs, which actually are the need of the hour.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we should dive into the details there. And Sudisha, you want to say something? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I actually had a counterpoint to what Adu was saying, because the way you presented about the four different revolutions, Sridhar, from what I can see, we were inventing and discovering things which organically were going to create more jobs. So, for example, even though mechanization of agriculture was happening, at the same time, we discovered coal, which just naturally meant that industries are going to grow. I think this is the first revolution that we are living right now. Even though, based on the previous revolutions, we are conjecturing that something similar will happen and there'll be a growth of new jobs, even though a lot of jobs will be redundant. I personally do not have that positive outlook yet, because I'm seeing a lot of talk about a lot of the jobs becoming redundant. For example, bank tellers, right? But at the same time, I haven't come across anything specific as to the kind of jobs that we can expect in the future, that through artificial intelligence, there'll be a growth of these jobs, for example, which I was seeing with the other three revolutions. It was very obvious that, for example, with the invention of internet, there's going to be a growth of jobs, right? So that's a bit interesting to me, that this is probably the first revolution among the four we've seen in our civilization where it's a little bit scary, for me at least.
Yeah.
I don't have that positive outlook, and I would like my opinion to be changed. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think let's think about it this way, right? I mean, I think nobody really knows that the extent to which artificial intelligence will transform the way jobs are being done today. Yeah. I think people can guess and talk about specific areas where artificial intelligence will come in and take away jobs. But at the same time, you also have to realize that somebody has to work on those artificial intelligence products and solutions which will take over those jobs. So there's going to be people who are sort of creating that, and there will be new applications which come out of it, which will things that we couldn't do before. I think that's the key thing. Why do we think there are only so many things that we have to do on this planet today? And they're being done by, say, 3 billion people who are in the workforce. And now, if artificial intelligence were to come, maybe 1 billion people will be rendered unnecessary, because artificial intelligence can do the work that 1 billion people are doing. And maybe only 2 billion people will be doing some work, right? So that assumes that there's only so much that we're going to create and do as a planet. The reality is that we will do more. Right? Because there are more people who are going to be available and free, there will be more things that are being done. And you could have more people spending time on art. There could be more people spending time on entertainment. The time that we spend on things that could become different. The number of hours that we work in a day could change. I mean, so many other things could happen, which will transform the way we live and work. And therefore, it's important for us to, I think, learn from history to realize that it's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
It's not about existing people, existing output, existing products, existing solutions, and just replacing that with technology and artificial intelligence or whatever, but really about the fact that more can be done, right? So access to education, which was probably limited to a certain number of people today, could increase quite dramatically, because you now have the internet, because you may have artificial intelligence which will help you to personalize the needs of individual learners and help people learn better and faster and more and so on, right? Time that is spent on learning things by rote could be replaced by spending time on analytical thinking and creative thinking, which it's these 803 organizations which were surveyed in this report have stood out and said, hey, these are the 2 skills that are most important. I think what will definitely change is that the skills we have today are going to be inadequate for us to remain relevant in the future. And new ideas will come. I don't think the world will allow lots of people to just remain idle and to do nothing at all, right? I mean, the world has to progress, and the world will, and we will all do different things. We will spend our time in more meaningful ways than probably we are doing today. I mean, I think that's the way I look at it, Sudisha.
Yeah. I don't want to add on, I think when I was reading through the report, while I agree we don't know how AI seems to be a buzzword right now, I'll be honest. We don't know, and most AI researchers will tell you, we don't know how this technology is going to evolve, right? What barriers we're going to breach. But the way the report interprets it today is mostly in the field of generative AI and LLMs, which are large language models, which essentially mean content creation, right? Or generating the fun stuff that you've seen, writing your email for you, right? And from that, a few interesting pieces from the report that stood out to me. One, the human machine frontier, as the report assesses it, has definitely shifted. What we're seeing is, when the report was run recently, the organizations kind of estimate that about 34% of business related tasks are going to be performed by machines, which means 66% are still going to be performed by humans, right?
Yeah.
That's a negligible shift of just 1% against what they were anticipating in 2020.
Yeah.
Having said that, in 2020, when they were asked, in the next 5 years, what percentage of jobs are going to be automated, they said almost 50%. So
Correct.
clearly
It's
that hasn't happened.
47% to be precise. Yeah, that's
47,
true.
exactly.
Yeah.
So that clearly that hasn't happened. And people tend to definitely overestimate some of the pieces. And we don't know how technology is evolving as well, right? And again, the current version of AI that is being touted, which is generative AI and specifically only LLMs, what we're also seeing is globally, yes, there will be a decline of data entry clerks, administrative and executive secretaries, perhaps, security guards, accounting, bookkeeping. Those are other pieces that I saw. But what there is going to be an increase of, you would think it's going to be largely data scientists, but I was surprised to find it agricultural equipment operators, heavy truck and bus drivers, which we saw in the UK during time of Brexit, was a big category in demand, right? Because those are pieces that the current version of technology that we have can still not automate and are very specific human skill sets at this point, and are also impacted by things like shortening of supply chains and things like that, which are an output of probably using AI, machine learning, and data and technology in our supply chains, right? So my point being, I think the outcomes that can be created can often be not what we anticipate in a straight-jacketed manner. And so it might actually be a very exciting time as well. But one, as Sridhar said, that requires us to constantly think about reskilling, upskilling, and finding the right skill sets for this new labor market domain. Sudisha.
Yeah, and actually, based on your point, just a positive outlook that I just got was, with all these low wage jobs going away, maybe not everybody has to work. One person can earn enough for the whole family. So that would be something interesting. And with such technical jobs most likely waiting to happen, I think it's quite possible that the wages will also go up. They'll be enough for a whole family, for example. So that's definitely a positive trajectory that I can anticipate.
Yeah. And the other thing that I agree with you, Sudisha. And I think the other point was to take forward from what Anu was saying. In 2020, when this report was written, they did say that 47%, at that point, about 33% of the jobs were done by machine and 67% by humans. At that point, they said that it'll become 47% in the next 5 years, and everybody was sort of alarmed. And in reality, only 1% increase happened. It moved up from 33% to 34%. And now they're saying that 42% of in the next 5 years, they expect that by 2027 or so, 42% of all the jobs will be done by machines and 58% by humans. Maybe it'll get there, maybe it won't, right? So I think that's number one for us to think about. But also what I'm seeing, and I think like what you caught on to something very important, Sudisha, that the kind of jobs that are getting replaced are not the ones which are very high-end, earning great wages, right? The ones which are getting replaced are the ones which are slightly more lower-end, etc. And the ones which are coming in seem to require greater level of education and skill and so on, and therefore should ideally pay more. So overall GDP growth may go up. Inequality in the world might increase. But like you said, maybe we will earn enough to be able to create a more equitable society through other means, right? So we might be in a position to give everybody a universal basic income, which allows, and because artificial intelligence is able to create enough surplus in the hands of you, and therefore, it may not be required for everybody to be just doing dead-end jobs, and most people can then focus on pursuing their passions. It could just be that, right? I don't know. And more on this after a short break. I think we'll come back after a break and talk about India and other aspects of it as well, and how this affects India most specifically.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Okay, and welcome back. And so, yeah, Sudisha, well, just before we took the break, we decided that we should talk about India. But I think before you get there, I think Anu has something to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to continue a thought that we were on, which is what will happen as we said, lower income, lower skill based jobs get replaced. Something that the report actually addresses is during the time of COVID. I mean, when job losses happen, they don't tend to be equitable, right? And Sridhar, you said inequity might go up, right? So during COVID, all of us know women were disproportionately affected, youth were disproportionately affected, right? So those who were marginalized tend to be more affected. And while there were short term measures in place like direct benefit transfers, lots of governments had some of these measures in place, which are now being phased out. There is a need for us to look at what happens in the medium and the long term. How do we continue supporting these marginalized communities? But more than that, as well, we also need to look at the fact that nearly 2 billion workers globally are actually in informal employment, right? Which represents about 70% of workers in developing and low income countries, as well as 18%, which was a surprising number to me, in high income countries, right? So given their susceptibility to economic shock, their need for better representation and this need for a longer term shift towards formalization, capturing more data, etc. as well, I think there is an urgent need for us to also think about policy interventions that think about reallocation of jobs in addition to upskilling and reskilling. And to your point earlier, I think you alluded to it, universal basic income or some sort of a social security net to those who are more susceptible to these job loss shocks, right? And I thought that I just wanted to add that point, which is the fact that there is a real cost of living crisis, which is actually concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, the Balkans, etc. And that is just highlighting the fact that those who are in non-standard employment, because we tend not to capture them in these kind of reports, will need more protection as we move forward to make sure inequity doesn't go up. And I think that could be a good segue to India, because I'm actually quite interested to understand what happens in India when we have these next generation of jobs.
Yeah. So I think let's go into India. And before that, I just wanted to point out one interesting thing that I noticed when I was looking at some data in terms of areas where unemployment rates have gone up and areas where unemployment rates have come down. And when you look at it across the globe, especially in the more affluent countries, you're noticing that there's a less reduction in jobs for people who are highly educated. And the people who are less educated have been more affected by some of these disruptions, especially during COVID, etc. It's the people who are at the bottom of the pyramid who sort of lost more jobs, while the more educated people got better jobs. While in India, it seems to be the other way. While there's rising unemployment amongst those who are more educated, and the people who are less educated seem to be finding jobs. This is something that I noticed in that report. And then over to you, Sudisha. You want to sort of tell us more about India and how it's coping with all these changes?
Yeah, so the couple of things that caught my attention. The first interesting bit that caught my attention in the report was the rate of unemployment in first quarters of all the years since 2018. So according to the graph for India, it peaked, the unemployment rate, it peaked in 2020, which was almost between 8 to 9%, which is understandable considering the COVID situation. But it became almost negligible in Q1 of 2022. And this was interesting to me because we've been traditionally looking at the data as CMI in the 20 million jobs project, and their data will show otherwise. From what I can remember, there were definitely signs of recovery in the employment rate in Q1 of last year, but none to the extent that the Future of Jobs report mentions. And according to another graph, informal employment in India is hovering around 25%, which is a lot if you consider India's population and what this innocent percentage can represent in actual numbers. And why it's important is because when you have such a large section of the population enrolled in informal employment, you're opening them to the difficulties of obtaining social protection. And this can include unemployment benefits, wage subsidies, etc. In India specifically, the people who are generally enrolled in informal employment are the ones who lack literacy, enough literacy, or even financial literacy, right? They might not have a bank bank account, for example, or maybe they are living in a remote part of a village where it's very difficult for them to go every day to the bank and operate their account or something, right? So in India, it's not looking very great. Not only do these people need to navigate through the difficult systems of obtaining social protection, but governments are also burdened by this additional responsibility of providing the social protection to these people in the first place. But at the same time, in terms of informal employment, we are actually doing a lot better than several countries. In the graph that I saw, India's percentage, places like Brazil, Mexico, Bulgaria, etc., this percentage was more than 60%. So I think with the digitization efforts that even the Modi government is really working on, it'll be a bumpy ride for sure, and it has been. But I think that it will show signs of recovery in the future, and the kind of digital revolution that's happening in India, it's going to pay its reward, hopefully, and this number can reduce. Another interesting bit that I really liked reading about was that the two industries in the world that have the highest level of green skill intensity is our manufacturing and the oil and gas industry. And by green skill intensity, it means that there is potential for normal jobs to transition to green jobs. And there's also potential to create green jobs out of nothing. So that was interesting. And what was another interesting factor was that India is actually in the top 3 on the list of countries that are expected to add green jobs in the oil and gas industry. So that's interesting. I'm hoping to see that the PSUs and the private companies in India which are operating in the oil and gas industry may add, the direction that they are planning to take, if they are setting up wings which are just focusing on ESG standards, that will be interesting to see. And another interesting point was that, and this is not just specific to India, but in India, it's also happening, which is that since COVID, there has been a decline in social jobs. And social jobs are generally care work, nurses, teachers, and even hospitality, waiters, and I don't know, something similar to that, right? A great amount of decline in India. In fact, India is in the 7 countries where job growth has been slowest when it comes to social jobs. But at the same time, non-social jobs have actually seen an upward trend. So while if you just concentrate on the decline of social jobs, it can paint a depressing picture. If you look at the other side, it's looking good that maybe these people are transitioning to better jobs. Maybe they are getting skilled with adoption of technology. So that's great. And the most important bit for India is that there is expected to be a 22% churn as compared to the global average of 23%. And that's interesting because of how it will impact the unemployment rate. Initially, I did not really have a positive outlook because of the scale at which AI is growing and the scale at which new tools are coming, Mid-Journey, ChatGPT and all that. So we don't know the kind of trajectory this thing will take. But at the same time, I also have hope for the country which is so savvy about electronics and IT and everything. I think if there's one country that can really, grow along with technological advancement, it's India. I think we hold immense potential to invent new jobs. So I'm really hopeful for that at the same time. And 60% of Indian companies think that broader applications of ESG standards will drive job growth, which is also interesting when you look at the kind of issues that businesses face in India. So a lot of businesses complain about power issues, for example, right? They're not getting adequate power to carry out their businesses properly. There are a lot of power outages and a lot of rent seeking that happens also when it comes to business operations. So with new ESG standards and new development of environment-friendly technologies, I think there can be localization or distribution of such power. So for example, just imagine a factory fully operable on solar energy, for example. I think in the future, these things can be made possible. And that really unburdens discoms, for example, or the government, for example, on distribution of power. So that's just one example. But localization and decentralization of such things can be really positive for India. And these are actually just the things that caught my eye in the report with respect to India.
Sure, that's absolutely interesting. I was also thinking about the key findings from the report across the globe. And they talk about how economic health and geopolitical trends have created divergent outcomes for labor markets globally. There have been tight global labor market conditions in high-income countries, but higher unemployment in low to middle-income countries compared to pre-COVID times. They talk about how technology adoption will remain a key driver of business transformation in the next 5 years. They talk about new and frontier technologies. 85% of the companies surveyed said they're going to adopt new and frontier technologies, and they have to adopt new ESG standards. The largest job creation effects also come from both these areas, environmental, technological, and economic trends. They seem to be creating jobs as well as depleting jobs. And they talk about investments in green transitions and supply chains becoming more localized, leading to more jobs. And at the same time, slower economic growth across the globe, so short supply shortages due to ESG constraints and rising costs of inputs could pay sport to some of these growth of ideas that we have. They talked about within technology adoption, they talked about how big data, cloud computing, and AI feature highly on likelihood of adoption and new jobs created in digital platforms and apps, e-commerce, education and workforce technologies, the adoption of robots, power storage technology, and distributed ledger, though which gave a lot of hope a little while back, seem to be ranking lower on the list for those surveyed. But they're talking about most technologies on jobs is supposed to be net positive on jobs over the next 5 years. That's the good news. They say big data and analytics, environmental management technologies, encryption and cybersecurity. Anu talked about agricultural technologies and like agricultural machine operators, etc. They talked about the structural change, right? There is going to be a structural churn and 23% of the people will sort of be impacted by it. There's also a view that 6 out of 10, but if you look at it, they say that 6 out of 10 people, 10 workers will require retraining or upskilling, but only half those people have access to training, and that's a troubling thing. Similarly, the skills that companies report to be increasing in importance don't seem to be figured in their corporate upskilling strategies. They say one skill is important, but they don't seem to be doing much about it. Respondents also express confidence in developing the existing workforce, but they're less optimistic in the long term for will there be enough talent in the areas that they want? They talk about investing in learning and on-the-job training and automating processes, but most people see funding of these skills training as an effective intervention, which governments need to sort of get involved in for connecting talent to it. So there is going to be huge amounts of disruption, but how? I think the biggest challenge is that the rate of change is so high that in the past, you could take 10 years, you could see that this skill will be required in the next 10 years, and you could acquire that skill slowly over the next 2-3 years, become an early mover in the space. And by the time that particular area like analytics sort of becomes important, you could be reasonably well versed in it and be in a position to take advantage of it. Today, the change that's happening, the disruptions that are taking place are happening very quickly, not giving people enough time to acquire the skills that they need to remain relevant. And that might be the biggest challenge, right? So I think our earlier idea, Anu and Sudisha, about career impact bonds and how they can help finance upskilling, how we can let the market decide what the right skills are. While this report has given us a lot of indication about the kind of jobs that might be in demand in the future and so on, I'm not sure everybody knows enough to be able to specifically say these are the skills. The best way to do it is let the market decide what skills are being valued. The market will and have the ability to collect data about what skills are in demand, what skills are in short supply, who are the best people to learn how to upskill these skills from. And I think our career impact bonds, where people get at-risk loans in order to acquire training and pay for that training only when they actually get jobs that help them to earn more than they're earning currently. I think that would ensure that in a scalable fashion, people across the globe can go out and acquire more skills. So I think it's important for us to delve deeper into this area of financing upskilling. I think that's really the area where I think all of us need to focus on. And that's one area where governments can intervene. Because if governments can intervene in another way, they can come in and say, let's ban artificial intelligence. Let's not allow companies to do further research in this space. Let's not allow products to come out where artificial intelligence is used. And all that will be completely counterproductive. I think that horse has left the stable, and the best we can do is find ways of upskilling ourselves and upskilling large parts of our population by finding ways to finance effectively. Any final thoughts, Anu?
Yeah, I think actually, as I was reading the report, I had a similar reflection, Sridhar, is that there is our career impact bond idea, I think needs to be delved deeper into for two perspectives. One is the modality of it, at-risk loans, and how do we ensure that people get access to the capital and the skills that they need. But the other part that we've often spoken about is just having an access to an understanding what is a true indicator of what the market needs, right? As I was reading through it, the biggest policy intervention that companies tend to want is in the space of skilling from the government. But the second big thing that they've also pointed out is when governments think skilling, they tend to think adult skilling. There is a huge need to also think about how do you connect school curriculums and essentially skills that children are gaining in their early adulthood or in their late teenage to relevant or market relevant skills. Because as you said, it's no longer a choice to make in terms of after you've entered the workforce, now you'll pivot in a few years. You kind of need to stay fresh. So I agree with you. And that was a very similar reflection that I had as well in terms of what the government and what policy outcomes could be used to support this evolving labor market situation that we see.
Sudisha?
And no additions to that, just a lot of wishful thinking. I can imagine my future just living in my house. Lots of robots are just doing the job for me, making money for me.
God, that sounds like Black Mirror, Sudisha. I'm not sure I want to live in that future with you.
Yeah, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I think it's going to be great, guys. I think, if the past is any indicator of what the future holds for us, there will be lots of disruption. There will be a lot of pain. But I think at the end of it all, we'll come out a slightly better society and a slightly more equitable and better society than we have today.
Yeah, I think we need to be intentional about it. And now I'm going to go sign up for a artificial intelligence course on Coursera.
There you go. Cool. All the best, guys. And we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you very much for listening, everyone.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.